Hello, everybody. Good to see you once again through a lecture video. As you all know, unfortunately, Blackboard decided to crash on Monday, about 20 or 30 minutes before our session. So, some of you did end up making it to the session, and thank you. And to those of you who couldn't make it, that's no problem. Of course, nothing that's your fault. So, I'm going to record this pretty short lecture video. And this is, again, our week 4 lecture video. But a couple of things that I want to mention that have to do with our schedule from the outset, and these are both very important. So you'll also see this in an email from me, but I just want to tell you in person through video what they are. First of all, and this is a mistake that I made on our course calendar, so I want to be clear about that. Next Monday, September the 28th, as you probably know, is a day in which all classes are canceled because of, religious holidays. And I didn't note that in our course calendar. Of course, that would normally be a day that I would like us to meet on Zoom, even though we haven't been able to yet. So instead, what we'll do is we'll meet on Wednesday, 9:30, September 30th, on Zoom at 5, if Blackboard works. So we're crossing our fingers. And at the same time, that same day, I'll also post next week's discussion board. And you'll have until the weekend to finish that because you're not getting the Monday lecture until Wednesday. The second thing that's very important is that what I've decided to do, in large part because we haven't had a chance to meet on Zoom yet, is to push back the midterm 1 week. So if you look in your course calendar, you will see that it says that we are having a midterm exam, of course, on Blackboard, week 7, 2 weeks from today. That'll actually be week 8, so we're just pushing it back 1 week. And next week, when we meet on Wednesday, I'll talk a little bit more about that exam and give you a little bit of a heads up about what kind of questions it'll be. But in short, it'll be short answers. So again, we can talk about that next week. So those are two very important announcements. First, no class next Monday, which is not noted in the syllabus. That's a religious holiday. There are no classes at all throughout the CUNY system. So of course we won't meet via Zoom that day. And therefore, our Zoom meeting, if everything goes well, will be next Wednesday, September 30th. And second, the midterm will be pushed back 1 week from week 7 to week 8. Okay, so the point of, or the theme of this week is the rise of the British American Empire. And as usual with these videos, go ahead and pull up the slideshow that you can find on Blackboard under course materials. And that way you can read along with me as I refer to the slides. So the title, again, The Rise of the British American Empire, 1688 to 1763, is the main theme of this class. And what this reflects is the fact that over the time period that you see there, and I'll just call it roughly the first half of the 18th century, we see the British Empire's American colonies, and therefore in a very general sense, the British Empire as a whole, the mother country and the colonies, rise to become the world's, or at least the Atlantic world's, most powerful empire, both militarily and also financially. And so those will be the two main themes that we talk about. We'll talk quite a bit today about the colonial economies and how they fit into the British Empire, how they contributed to the British Empire's rise. Before ending this session by talking a little bit about a war that is the backdrop for the major theme for the next 2 weeks, which is the events leading to the American Revolution. So if you flip down to slide number 2, the first slide with full text, we're going to start in the year 1688. And the reason we're starting with 1688 is because there was a transformation in England, in Great Britain, the mother country, a political revolution, which, as we'll see, had a pretty significant impact on the British North American colonies. And that is the so-called Glorious Revolution. As you can just even tell from hearing that phrase, or if you've learned about this, this is a revolution that is generally spoken of in positive terms. there are a lot of deep reasons for the Glorious Revolution that we simply don't have time to go into here. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of them, and more importantly, at the end of this slide, talk about how this impacted North America, which is the subject of our class. But the first deep root to mention is a long-standing conflict. This is the first bullet point between Protestant Christianity, Protestant Christians, and Catholic Christians. Just got an email, sorry. In England, and this religious conflict was the short-term, or one of the major, I should say, short-term causes of the so-called Glorious Revolution. And in short, this conflict dates back to the 1540s, and this is why we're talking about much deeper roots that I don't have time to go into very much. But by the 1680s, a couple of changes had occurred which brought this conflict back into the forefront of English life, British life. And that is because in the year 1685, so just a few years before this glorious revolution, a new king assumed the throne of England, James II. You see him there. And James II was a Catholic, and he was very open about his Catholic faith. Why was this a problem for many people in Britain? Well, because technically Great Britain, and this also includes the British North American colonies, were officially Protestant, meaning non-Catholic Christian nation. The official Church of England was called the Church of England. It's also known as the Anglican Church, which is not a Catholic denomination. It's a Protestant denomination. James was Catholic for a lot of reasons that I don't have time to go into here. But what was the scariest part for many Protestants in Great Britain, and indeed many people in North America, British colonists, was that James II, as was the custom of Catholic monarchs in Europe in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, sought to rule as an absolute monarch, an absolutist, which meant that he believed that he had a so-called divine right of kings, meaning that he believed God, the Christian God, as did other Catholic monarchs in countries like Spain and France, for example, believed that the Christian God had selected him to be, and his family, to be his representatives on earth. And therefore, Catholic absolutist monarchs like James II believed that no dissent, no criticism of he or his government could be tolerated. This generated significant worry within Great Britain that the customary so-called rights of English people would be violated by a king who believed he had absolute power. And to point out this phrase, the Dominion of New England, this is just one example of how James II sought to rule as an absolute monarch, but an example that is specific to North America. In 1685, the same year that James II became the King of England, he declared, primarily because he despised Puritans in Massachusetts, he declared that the colonies of Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, the so-called New England colonies, would be stripped of their independence as colonies and would be combined with New York and New Jersey into a super colony called the Dominion of New England. So this was interpreted by many people in North America, and also people in the mother country itself, that this was James seeking to strip the right to self-government, in this case of the New England colonies, New York and New Jersey. And this was viewed as yet another example of the ways in which an absolute monarch could attempt to use power to force political change, in this case, upon unwilling subjects. And again, this is specific to North America. So this generated criticisms of King James II, generated a political movement to dethrone him. And Prince William, a Dutch prince, and Princess Mary, an English princess who were married, were invited to invade and then take control of the monarchy of Great Britain and its empire. And if you scroll down, actually, just to the picture below, you can see a picture of William and Mary there. That's actually their wedding portrait. William and Mary were Protestant Christians, and because they were invited by a powerful faction of elites Protestants in Parliament to assume the throne of Great Britain, a deal was made in which two fundamental political principles were enshrined for Great Britain and its empire. The first was that as a result of the negotiations to allow William and Mary to become the King and Queen of England, their supporters demanded that a Bill of Rights, and that was officially created in 1689, be created. A Bill of Rights that would list specific rights that individual British subjects had that the monarchs could not violate. And some of them are also enshrined in the American Bill of Rights from 1790, which we'll talk about actually after the midterm. But I'll just throw one of these rights at you. You might be wondering, well, what rights? One right that is also in the U.S. Bill of Rights is that was derived from the English Bill of Rights. There we go. Was the right to a trial by jury. That's just to pick one example. The second principle that was in place by the transition to William and Mary of power as co-monarchs in England was that a so-called mixed or balanced constitution was agreed upon. Now, you see that word constitution, and you immediately think a written document, probably like the United States Constitution. This actually isn't a written document. It's an understanding that was in place during this glorious revolution that actually continues to be something that people in Great Britain hold up as a positive. Usually it's framed as a positive outcome of this glorious revolution. And it's in short, a power sharing structure between the three primary social and legal groups within England. The monarchs, which share power with the nobility, the hereditary aristocrats, people who are born into positions of privilege and elevated social classes, would also share power with the monarch, in addition to sharing power with the commons, which is everybody else in English society, anybody who was not a monarch, which obviously is not people, only a handful of people, nor a member of the hereditary nobility. This is why you might be familiar with the structure of the British Parliament. There is a House of Lords, which is a body that is composed entirely of members of the nobility, and there is a House of Commons to which members are elected, and that still continues to exist today. The final outcome that I want to just briefly touch on is this term at the very bottom of the slide called salutary neglect. This is where we see the principles of the Glorious Revolution directly applied, both in philosophy and in practice to North America. One of the major outcomes of the Glorious Revolution was that it set in motion a policy towards governing the North American colonies, which was hands-off. The term salutary neglect means beneficial neglect. What I mean by those two terms, hands-off and salutary neglect, are that the monarchs of England, beginning with William and Mary, in practice developed a policy whereby they did not interfere directly with the day-to-day internal operations of their North American colonies. They would leave the colonies, in other words, to govern themselves, as long as those colonies contributed to the overall, especially economy and trade of the British Empire. So as long as the colonies remained profitable, they were more or less left to govern themselves. And I bring this up now because what we'll begin seeing next week with the events of 1763 onward is that once this policy of salutary neglect began to be rolled back, and the British monarchy and Parliament in particular began to more directly interfere with affairs in the North American colonies, this is when we begin to see colonial protest. I'm going to now switch over to the fourth slide, a slide called Colonial Economies. So we're going to kind of shift gears here and take a kind of broad view of the way in which the British Empire's economy grew, and the role that the colonies played in it. And the first and most important point to make in terms of the economic growth of the British Empire is that it was largely fueled by the rise of British participation in the African slave trade. The purchase of enslaved peoples in the African continent, usually along the western coast of Africa, and their transportation through the so-called Middle Passage, horrifying forced migration across the Atlantic Ocean, and then their enslavement in the American colonies in the Caribbean and in North America. So we see this peak begin to really rise in the first half of the 18th century. You can see there, I'd say, roughly 1700 to 1763. And I'll give you a number that I hope will give you a sense of scale and of the horrifying violence and dehumanization that was a part of the African slave trade. Between those years, 1700 and 1763, the British Empire alone was responsible for importing roughly 1.1 million enslaved people from Africa into the American colonies. The vast majority of these enslaved people were sent to the Caribbean, but especially to Jamaica and Barbados. But a significant number, about 125,000, were brought to mainland North America, especially to Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. One of the best ways to sort of begin to get a grasp of the experience of an enslaved person in this African slave trade is through the autobiography of Olaudah Equiano. That's the name you see there. And perhaps you've heard of him. He's famous now to historians because he left a complete autobiography in which he described every step of his life that led him ultimately to becoming enslaved and eventually becoming freed, which is when he wrote his autobiography, which wasn't published until 1789, but which begins in the 1750s. That's when he was enslaved in Africa. And in it, he describes, for example, his enslavement. He was kidnapped, not by European traders, but by Africans. And that's just the basic fact of the African slave trade, is that Africans enslaved other Africans for a variety of reasons, because of warfare, because of religious conflict. He describes that. He describes being marched over the course of several months from the interior part of Africa to the western coast of Africa, where he was then purchased by British slave traders. He describes that very vividly. He describes the fear that he had, of course, not knowing what was going to happen to him. He describes very vividly the surprise he had upon seeing people who had red hair, these slave traders. He had never seen anybody with red hair before. He describes most vividly about his biggest fear upon being purchased by British slave traders, which was that he would be eaten. That was his, and other enslaved people with whom he was forced onto a ship. That was their initial fear. That didn't happen, of course, but they were taken to Barbados, where they were sold. And Olaudah Equiano actually was then sold to Virginia, and then later to Boston. And along the way, he gained an education. He became literate. And he also managed to work and save enough money to purchase his own freedom, which was not an option for the majority of enslaved people, but some enslaved people in the Americas did have the ability to work and earn money to buy their own freedom. And that's what Olaudah Equiano did. So this is a really powerful, again, example of the ways in which the African slave trade inflicted horrifying experiences upon the enslaved themselves. The African slave trade, in general, was an extremely lucrative and profitable trade, as horrifying as it was for the British Empire. And it's a part of, getting down to the second point, a rise in what historians call the consumer revolution of the 18th century. And this is, by the way, discussed in detail in American Yacht, chapter 4, the reading for this week, section 3, if I remember correctly. And you can read more about it there. There's just a couple of points that I want to highlight. And first is, what was the consumer revolution? Well, it's a term that describes the ways in which colonists in North America began to have, because of the overall rise of the British imperial economy, including the African slave trade, began to accrue wealth and had greater access to material goods that constituted a revolution in the day-to-day lives of normal people across the American colonies. And the goods that you see in that term, the British Empire becoming an empire of goods, were primarily household objects, were the basis for this consumer revolution. The most important of those is cloth, textiles. Textiles manufactured in India and in Great Britain began to become more widely available to North American colonists. And this led to a rise, at least for white free colonists, of standards of living. Other objects that I could focus on, there are hundreds of them. I might mention, for example, mirrors first became widely available as a consumer item in the 18th century as a result of this consumer revolution. Other items I might mention, porcelain plateware, which is called china, and we still call it china today, became more widely available. The experience of being able to purchase and consume manufactured goods was different in the 18th century than the lives of North American colonists in the 17th century, where in the 17th century, most colonists had to make most of the household goods that they used, or to trade with neighbors or people in their small locality. By the 18th century, they began to be able to buy these things, manufactured goods from England in particular. And this led to the rise, this consumer revolution, or another way of stating that again is that historians describe the British Empire as an empire of goods, of manufactured goods. What this led to was the emergence of something called consumer culture in North America. And indeed, one could say, and I'm suggesting it now, that this is sort of the origins of consumer culture today. A culture in which the purchase and consumption of goods of all varieties today, it's like phones, for example, not in the 18th century, of course, or clothing, or any number of goods that we sort of today almost take for granted. But the consumption of goods becomes an end to itself. So another way of thinking about the rise of this consumer culture is that people began to view the consumption of goods not entirely or primarily as a way to secure their own survival, but for its own enjoyment. And I think that's still true today. We all live as consumers, and we all live in a very much a consumerist culture. So this is really the beginning origins of that. But related to this, and this is getting to the importance of print culture, was the rise of print culture. As I just said, this consumer revolution was primarily centered around household objects, but it also included information. It wasn't until the 18th century that North Americans could print their own literature, newspapers, works of nonfiction and fiction, is what we would call them today. All of these things were unavailable to North Americans before the so-called consumer revolution. In fact, the first printing press wasn't imported into North America until one was brought to Boston in the year 1708. So almost 100 years after Massachusetts was founded, technically 88 years. It took 88 years, I'll restate that, for the first printing press to come to North America. And this allowed North Americans, as the rise of a print culture grew, to consume information that they generated themselves. And you can see an image on slide number 5 of an example of this. This is an image of the first page of, you can see the title, a weekly newspaper called the Pennsylvania Gazette. And if you look very closely, you can find the date. It's the third line down. That is from late September, early October, actually right about now, this time of the year, in the year 1729. So this is almost 300 years ago. And I won't ask you to read the text. It's very small. But I'll just tell you that this is actually a particularly important issue because it is the first issue that was printed by the new owner of the printing press and owner of the Pennsylvania Gazette named Benjamin Franklin, who became, as I think many of us know, one of the most famous North Americans and one of the most famous Americans, and continues to be so today. So the rise of print culture is, again, related to this consumer revolution, if we think of print culture as the ability to consume information. So I think this is an important point to make. And if you look at image 6, I'm not going to talk too much about it right this second because I'm going to ask you to write about it for this week's discussion board. But look at this image, this family portrait, and think about ways that it relates to this consumer revolution that I've talked briefly about. And that's discussed in American Yacht, Chapter 4. So I'm not ignoring it, but I am moving on. And you'll write about that for this week's discussion board. So I'm going to take a sip of water and continue to slide number 8, which is called The Great Awakening. And again, this is discussed at length in Chapter 4 of American Yacht, so I'll just touch on a couple of what I think to be important points. The Great Awakening, which was, as you can see in point 1, a series of religious revivals beginning in the late 1730s, stretching into the 1740s, was itself a reaction to this consumer revolution. So there's a connection between this consumer revolution and this Great Awakening. And that is that in that time period that you see there, what you begin to see first in New England and then transmitted to the mother country, and then followers in the mother country bringing the Great Awakening ideas to the southern part of North America. So it's an interesting transmission from New England to England, and then back to North America again, this time to the southern colonies. This was a reaction by ministers. First, the man that you see on slide number 9, scroll down, Jonathan Edwards, who began to fear that their congregations were becoming less careful about maintaining their spiritual life because they were becoming too obsessed with accruing material wealth and material goods. So this is a reaction to this consumer revolution that some ministers began to fear that the souls of the individual members of their congregations were deteriorating and began to argue for a quote-unquote new birth of spiritual life, one that would be very personal and emotional, and which would emphasize saving one's soul, achieving salvation by attempting to eschew, to give up on material wealth and material objects. This was called the Great Awakening, and that's a very suggestive name for it. The people awoke to the failure to tend to spiritual matters. And it started out initially as just local meetings, local sermons by individual preachers, but which began to really mushroom into, again, a movement that reached across the Atlantic to England and all the way down throughout the North American colonies. This movement, the Great Awakening, was promoted in the new style of religion. This new birth was promoted by charismatic, itinerant, meaning traveling preachers. And the most famous of these is George Whitefield. And you see his name on the second point, who's an itinerant, which again means traveling minister, who interestingly and tellingly was actually initially an actor who took the techniques of actors, right, projecting your voice, being very demonstrative, and applied them to preaching the gospel of the Great Awakening. And so he went on a 3-year tour of North America preaching this message from 1739 to 1740 and to 1741. And he became wildly popular. People across North America flocked to see him, this famous preacher, George Whitefield, in part because of his message, right, the so-called message of a new spiritual birth, but also because George Whitefield was savvy enough to use public relations techniques, which is a term we would use today, not an 18th century term, to promote himself. How did he do that? Through the rise of print culture. And actually, the most important thing that he did in this realm was to make a deal with Benjamin Franklin, who, as we just learned, was the proprietor of a newspaper. He made a deal in which he would give Benjamin Franklin his traveling itinerary, where he would be giving sermons at a particular time and place, so that Benjamin Franklin could promote them in the Pennsylvania Gazette, so that more and more people would buy the Pennsylvania Gazette. So that's what I mean when I say utilizing public relations techniques. It's using the media to promote, in his case, his popularity as a Great Awakening itinerant preacher. So that's just one example. And if you scroll down to slide 10 below Jonathan Edwards, you can see a picture of, George Whitefield ministering. And if you look really closely, he was kind of, I guess the colloquial term for it is cross-eyed, and it's something that everybody noted about him. So when you read letters and commentary of people who met George Whitefield, they would always mention this, and they would mention it in the context of saying that George Whitefield was just mesmerizing. Really sort of, as you can see in that picture, that woman in particular at the bottom of the picture is just really like almost hypnotized by George Whitefield. And just to wrap up this slide, the impact of the Great Awakening can be assessed in a couple of different ways, and this is something that historians have been arguing about for a very long time. For our purposes, what is important to note is, firstly, that this Great Awakening led to the new foundation of denominations of Protestant Christianity, including two of which are very large today, the Baptist denomination and Methodists. In a more cultural sense, because the Great Awakening and the sort of new birth of religiosity was initially aimed at the consumer revolution, but even more so was viewed as a new kind of way of viewing the world, it led many people to an attitude of questioning established authority and established institutions. And this is going to be important because we'll see that this attitude would, by the 1760s, become reflected in protest in North America against the British Empire. So I want to do one final slide, and it's called The Battle for the Continent, and then we'll sign off for the day. And this is the end of this first half of the 18th century, where we speak of a war which set the stage, as we'll see, for the events that ultimately led to American independence. And the battle for the continent here is referring to, and we're on slide 12 now, refers to North America. And if you go to the map just above slide 12, aka slide 11, you can get a little bit of a continent view, continent-wide view, that is the origins of the so-called battle for the continent. So if you look at that map, it just gives you a sense of the claims of European territories in North America, European nations in North America. Now, just to make perhaps an obvious point, but this does not reflect Native American populations, which were still much larger than the North American European populations. But you can get a sense for what territories European empires claimed in North America. So if you look, you see that the green on the Atlantic coast is British North America, which is in the year 1750 limited to a pretty small strip of land from the Atlantic coast to the Appalachian Mountains. A much larger territorial claim, as you can see in that purple or blue color, was that of France, which stretched all the way from Canada south, and it narrows, as you can see on that map, down to what's today Louisiana. And just for point of reference as well, and we haven't talked much about Spain at all in this class, Spain claimed territory all the way to the west coast, and that's that sort of pink color, salmon color, if you will, and then farther down into Mexico and ultimately Central America and South America. But the small region that I want to highlight here on this map, if you pull it up and look closely at it, is a territory just in the upper right along the border between green British North America and blue or purple French North America. And if you look closely, and you might have to take a second to find this, find a little square, which is a fort, and just inside the blue territory that's called Fort Duquesne, Duquesne. That was a French military outpost that is now today the city of Pittsburgh. So that's in what today is Western Pennsylvania. That little region right there, in and around Fort Duquesne, because it was along that border that you can see there between the green and the purple, had long been contested by Britain and France, British colonists, French colonists, going back decades. What happened in 1754, and this is the first point, is that there was a small clash between Virginia colonists, actually led by George Washington, and French military alongside their Native American allies on the Ohio River, which is where Pittsburgh is located. That started out as a very local conflict for claims to a relatively small amount of land in what's today Western Pennsylvania, but which ultimately drew both the British Empire and the French Empire into a long, bloody, and expensive war. Now, this war usually goes by two different names, and you can call it either, okay, for our purposes. The British North American colonists, and this is the phrase you've probably heard, or the name you've probably heard, called it the French and Indian War because they fought against France and their Native American allies in North America. Europeans called this war the 7 Years' War because by 1756, this local conflict had mushroomed into a war that engulfed Europe and in fact was fought simultaneously on multiple continents, in North America, in Europe, actually in Africa, and also in South America. So a true world war, and many military historians call this the First World War, not World War I, which happened in the 20th century, but a war fought by the same combatants simultaneously on multiple continents. This was, again, a very long, a very expensive, and a very bloody war. For our purposes, and they're somewhat narrow here, what's most important is that this war and the need to defend the British North American colonies from the French and Indians, we see the first attempts of North Americans to come together and coordinate, in this case, defense military activities amongst themselves. Before this time period, there had never been the suggestion that the North American colonists had any sort of shared identity other than being colonists within the British Empire. Most people in North America, if you could go back to ask them how they identified, would first say that they were British subjects of the British Empire. And if you pressed them, they would then say residents of the particular colony that they lived in. People didn't call themselves Americans, okay, as an identity until the 1750s. And the political event that we see reflect these early stirrings of some kind of Americanness identity is in the so-called Albany Congress, which met in 1754, was actually convened by Benjamin Franklin, who promoted it to try to bring together delegates from the various North American colonies to try to coordinate in a unified way how they would defend themselves in this French and Indian War. To promote the Congress, Benjamin Franklin created and then reprinted, if you go down to slide number 13, a woodcut that attempted to stir fear in the hearts of his readers that if the North American colonies did not join together, as you can read, then they would die, just like a snake being chopped up into bits, right? Which is what you can see there. And this kind of imagery would later be adopted during the American Revolution. This war ultimately ended in 1763. The treaty that ended it is the Treaty of Paris, as a victory for Great Britain. The main outcome for us is that as a result of this treaty, uh, all French territory in North America, west to the Mississippi River, became British territory. So the literal size of the land claims of the British Empire in North America uh, grew exponentially from that very small strip of land that you can see, relatively small strip of land that you can see in the map on page 11, to a much bigger chunk of land. And the fruits of that victory are what we'll actually begin with discussing next week. So I'll begin with discussing the so-called Proclamation Line and Pontiac's Rebellion. So I'll sign off there. Again, and you'll see this in an email, note that I've pushed the midterm back from week 7 to week 8. And also note that next week we're not meeting on Monday because of a religious holiday. And I mistakenly forgot to note that in the syllabus. So we'll meet on Wednesday instead. Okay, have a good rest of your day. And by the time you see this, you will also be able to, after watching this, complete the discussion board response for this week. Okay, thank you.